Hello. Hello everyone. My name is Kamesh. I'm from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. My research area is philosophy of science. So this is my talk. The title is the Hodgkin-Huxley model, explanatory force and explanatory aims. So I'll just give a simple introduction. First, the model is for the phenomenon of action potential. So an action potential is a sudden spike, the rise and fall of the membrane potential in a neuron. That's called the action potential, and it has been studied for more than several decades, from the 1930s and 40s. There were two electrophysiologists named Hodgkin and Huxley, and they came up with this mathematical model to describe and possibly explain the generation and propagation of action potential along the axonal membrane of neuron. So it's a mathematical model, so it uses an electrical equivalent circuit and several differential equations to describe the phenomenon of action potential. So within that model, I concentrate on a particular conflict between two philosophers named Craver and Arnon Levy. Basically, they both discuss the explanatory status of that particular model. So Craver argues that the H model is a deficient explanation because it is an attempted providing a mechanistic explanation, but it doesn't succeed in doing so. So that's why it's a deficient model. But Arnon Levy, on the other hand, argues that the model uses a different strategy called aggregative abstraction, and it comes up with this new conceptual framework called the discrete gating picture, which is somewhat novel in the field during that study. So therefore, in that respect, we can consider the model as an adequate model. So these are two conflicting points about that particular model. So in this talk, I would like to compare their arguments and analyze their different positions, and then explore the questions of what is an adequate explanation in neuroscience, and then I'll try to suggest that maybe we can understand this conflict better if we look at it in terms of explanatory aims. So this is the axonal membrane in a neuron, and it contains several voltage gated channels such as sodium channels, potassium channels, and other leak channels. So ions, sodium ions, potassium ions, chloride ions, proteins, they all move from inside to outside and outside to inside. And that's how, based on their transmembrane mobility, the membrane potential changes. And when it reaches a particular threshold, the action potential begins, and that's how it's transmitted from one end of the neuron to other end of the axonal membrane to the other end of the axonal membrane. And that's how the neurons communicate to each other and to other target cells, such as muscle cells. So here's how it happens. First, when a particular threshold is reached, sodium channels open and sodium ions enter from outside to inside, and that results in membrane potential going up. And then again, after it reaches a particular value, the potassium ions go outside, and it keeps continuous happening from one end to the other. That's how the action potential takes place. So this is the model that Hodgkin-Huxley came up with to capture the electrical properties and phenomena associated with that particular phenomenon called action potential. So that's the capacitor, and then there is a resistor. For sodium conductance, they used sodium resistor, and to represent potassium conductance, they use another resistor, which are all variable. And then there is another leak current in the membrane, which is leak conductance is constant. So that's why that resistor is not variable. So this is the basic circuit, and since they use the current, they use Ohm's law to come up with this basic equation. The total current is the sum of the capacitive current, sodium current, potassium current, and leak current, and they have these various formulas for that. So in order to proceed with the experiment, Hodgkin-Huxley used this newly introduced technique at that time called the voltage clamp technique to measure sodium and potassium conductances at various membrane potential values. And from those various values, they used methods of numerical analysis and curve fitting to come up with the following assumptions, which they called formal assumptions. So GK is potassium conductance, and GK bar is maximum potassium conductance, N power 4 And the variable n is considered as gating variable for potassium channels, and variables m and h are considered gating variables for sodium channels. And then these are all the other equations that they came up with using curve fitting procedures, various curve fitting procedures. So now Craver argues that in neuroscience, if adequate explanations work by showing how the explanatum phenomenon, the end result, is situated in the causal structure. So for Craver, adequate explanations can only be mechanistic explanations, and mechanistic explanations need to show how various parts, processes, powers, capacities, they all work together to give rise to the explanatum phenomenon. Here, in the Hodgkin-Huxley model for Craver, the equations do not really tell us how these various parts and processes work together to give rise to explanatum phenomenon, which is the action potential. So because of that, for him, these equations are not explanatory. So these equations are just phenomenal equations, which are just mere empirical descriptions. So they do not tell us why sodium and potassium conductances change the way they do. These equations don't really tell us how these channels open and close, and what's the underlying mechanism behind that opening and closing of various channels. So, but still, taken as a whole, within that model, Hodgkin-Huxley had some basic idea. They knew that sodium conductance mechanism and potassium conductance mechanism were independent. They didn't depend on each other. And they also were able to rule out certain other hypotheses regarding how the ions were transported from one end to the other, from inside to outside and outside to inside. They were able to rule out this mechanism called carrier mechanism, according to which there were some carrier particles that transported the ions from one end to the other. So they had some idea of the mechanistic details involved in the phenomenon. So we can say that they have some inadequate idea of the explanation. That's why Craver says it's a mechanism sketch, and it's an inadequate sketch. For Levy, he wouldn't consider the model as an attempt to provide a mechanistic explanation. For him, Hodgkin-Huxley introduced a novel kind of explanation, and that's called aggregative abstraction, where the whole cell behavior is depicted as the aggregate sum of the behavior of the parts. Here, the modelers purposefully abstract away from the details to give us a collective understanding of the whole level phenomenon. So that's why this is a different kind of explanation from mechanistic explanation. And the discrete gating picture, according to which each ion channels are discrete and selective, they are independently acting. And this picture is what's important about the Hodgkin-Huxley model, and for that we need to give the status of adequate explanation to HS model. So this is Levy's point, and he considers that single channel recordings provide empirical confirmation for this discrete gating picture. And just because these equations do not tell us how these ion channels open and close does not really matter, because they are not important. So for Levy, considering all these points, the HS model is not an adequate explanation, and it's an adequate explanation. So now that let's compare it. For Craver, the explanatory force of the model has to be with the descriptions of the underlying mechanisms, which are not provided by Hodgkin-Huxley. Therefore, the model lacks explanatory force. For Levy, the explanatory force lies with the aggregative abstraction, the discrete gating picture. Therefore, it has explanatory force. For Craver, the epistemic achievement of the model is its support for a particular causal picture, and that picture has not been provided by Hodgkin-Huxley. Therefore, it's inadequate. For Levy, the epistemic achievement of the model is its inspiration for other models, such as Connor-Stevens models, because it introduced that new conceptual framework called the discrete gating picture framework. So, and for Craver, these equations and the variables involved in those conductance equations, N, M, and H, they do not refer to any entity or activity in the neuron. They were just place fillers, or they can be considered as just modeling parameters that computationalists use. they don't really refer to anything in the neuron. So therefore, they lack explanatory force. But for Levy, these variables are part of the discrete gating picture, which is important from a model's point of view. Therefore, they have some kind of explanatory force. So for, like, as I argued before, for Craver, these variables need to refer to something in the world. If they don't refer to any part or activity in the neuron, then they cannot have any explanatory force. So, and for Craver, such details are important because only they can help us manipulate and control the behavior of the actual target system. Why those are important? Because an explanation containing more relevant detail about the component properties and activities that compose the given mechanism, such an explanation can help us answer more W questions, more what questions, or more questions, more answers about how the phenomenon will behave under different conditions. So this connection between explanation and control of the natural world can tell us why explanation is considered as such a distinct scientific virtue. So, and there are other authors in the mechanistic camp who also argue that this is how scientists actually proceed. When scientists want to explain how a particular phenomenon takes place, they postulate entities and activities and provide conditions on how those work together to help us to draw predictions based on that particular mechanism, and those predictions help us confirm whether the postulated entities and activities are there in the world or not. So for Craver, ultimately, adequate explanations need to give us an account of mechanisms and how such mechanisms are situated in the causal structure of the world. And again, Craver would argue against taking understanding as a reliable factor for an explanation, because for him, scientists cannot really distinguish between what's good understanding, bad understanding, because we have seen historically that even models that provide wrong understanding or misunderstanding can also work in many cases. So it's an unreliable indicator. So ultimately, it's not understanding, but the ability to answer more counterfactual questions and have more control over the natural world and the phenomenon of interest is the source of explanatory force. And Craver again Craver argues that for an adequate explanation, for an account of adequate explanation, it has to have three conditions. The first is descriptive adequacy, which is the account of explanation has to tell us what scientists do in that particular practice. So it has to be descriptively adequately describe the practice of scientists. The second question is the account of explanation has to tell us how explanation is different from other scientific activities. And the third question is that account of explanation has to provide the norms on the basis of which we can assess whether it's a good explanation or not. For Craver, mechanistic explanations satisfy all these three conditions. That's why he thinks mechanistic explanations are adequate explanations. And for Levy, as I argued before, the discrete gating picture provides a sense of understanding, a collective level understanding. And Levy again argues that such method of providing collective level understanding is followed in many disciplines. For example, in many disciplines such as ecology, population biology, the researchers typically seek to understand the dynamics of a collective level property as arising from the behavior of a large number of lower level individuals. And again, other examples are phenomena such as arabinose regulation system, galactose utilization system. And they can be understood not by going into specific details, but by representing them as abstract structures and by representing them as having such organizational features such as coherent and incoherent feed-forward loops. So we can take this as satisfying the first condition of descriptive adequacy that Craver gave, because this also tells us that scientists have this practice of representing whole level behavior as abstract systems. So again, from Levy's perspective, it is the understanding that abstractions provide that carries the explanatory force, and such higher level understanding can help us do higher level sciences without waiting for the results of lower level sciences, which we have all seen, and this is like commonly known. And again, HH model, that the original model that Hodgkin-Huxley came up with, it is useful in studying several neural processes, which are again useful for studying collision avoidance, time interval prediction, etc. So the mathematical model has its own applications as well. So let us now again go back to that point that Craver said. When Craver says that we cannot differentiate between understanding and misunderstanding, what he means is that even false explanations can provide us a sense of understanding. But how is the explanation false? Because it's not empirically true. But the thing is, when whatever problems that plague this account of this account of explanation, where we can't decide between whether it's empirically true or not, the same problem affects Craver's account of mechanistic explanations as well. For example, the authors Colombo, Hartman, and Yersel, they argue that even whether a mechanistic explanation is true or not, scientists cannot really find out whether the particular mechanistic explanation that they posited is true or not, because ultimately they evaluate the explanation based on its ability to predict and control the natural world. And we all know that even coherence is enough for us to work with the mechanistic explanation. Whether it's true or not is out of the question for many scientific practice. So from that, we can see that even Craver's own condition of norms of assessment fails for his own account of mechanistic explanation. So at best, we can see that mechanistic explanations hold water because they support more interventions on the natural system and more prediction and control. But the same point can be said for the Hodgkin-Huxley equations as well. The equations also tell us how the action potential will behave under different experimental conditions and under different current dynamics. So these equations are on the same board with respect to mechanistic explanation. So again, I'll just, in order to compare these two different camps on this explanatory debate, I'll just provide an analogy of my bicycle. Yeah, sure. So this is the mechanical explanation for a cycle is this. We can see that when a force is applied on a pedal, it goes down, the crank rotates and chain moves forward, and chain rotates also, and the cycle moves forward. This is the mechanical explanation, simple mechanical explanation for a cycle. But same way, we can come up with a mathematical model for how a cycle works. This is simple, like the function of distance traveled is directly proportional to the force applied. So from this simple mathematical model, we can develop more sophisticated models using piston engines, propeller tanks, etc. So the former mechanics explanation would help us control the particular bicycle, and later on would help us build new technology using technology with similar features. The same can be understood for action potentials as well. So I'm using this analogy to attack the condition that an account of explanation has to tell us why explanation is different from other scientific activities. My argument is that explanation does not have any intrinsic value. Again, so I'll just say how. So my conclusion is this. Explanation is not unique and has no intrinsic value because what we consider as a good explanation is dependent on whether it helps us control and predict the natural world. So explanation is not different from other scientific activities. It can be reduced to other activities such as control, prediction, manipulation, etc. So mechanistic explanations in neuroscience have explanatory force because they are developed for the purpose of controlling the phenomenon in question, and that's their use. And the causal picture is important only insofar as it helps us manipulate the world. This is my argument. And the same way, abstract models also have explanatory force because they are developed for another purpose, another aim, which is collective level understanding. And such collective level understanding can be used to produce artificial systems through simulation and other technological means. So again, whether the Hodgkin-Huxley model is adequate or inadequate cannot be answered without first answering which aim or use is better than the other. So this is how I end the conflict between. I try to understand the conflict between Levy and Craver. So, but this still there needs to further work needs to be done on thesis of explanatory aims. So that's all. Sessions are welcome. Thanks.